The courtroom was packed. People shifted in their seats, whispering among themselves. The air buzzed with curiosity, confusion, and a hint of amusement. At the center of it all, a teenage boy stood before the judge. His hands were steady, his face calm. He didn't look nervous. He didn't even look scared. The judge, an older man with deep-set eyes and a skeptical smirk, leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. "Son, do you even understand what's happening here?" he asked, his voice laced with condescension. The room chuckled. A kid in a courtroom? Representing himself? This had to be a joke. The teen didn't flinch. Instead, he lifted his chin, his voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. And if you'd allow me, I'd like to proceed." Another wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. The judge shook his head, rubbing his temple. "This isn't some school debate, son. Do you even know the law?" The teen's eyes didn't waver. "Yes, Your Honor. Better than most in this room." Silence. The smirk on the judge's face disappeared. The whispers in the room faded. Something about the way the boy spoke, sharp, confident, almost effortless, made everyone pause. This wasn't the response they expected. This wasn't the reaction of someone out of his depth. The judge's expression hardened. "Fine," he said, leaning forward. "Enlighten me. Tell me exactly why you think you can stand in my courtroom and play lawyer." The teen took a slow breath. "Because I'm not playing. And because I have evidence that will change everything." The room tensed. The judge frowned. "What evidence?" The teen reached into his worn-out backpack and pulled out a folder. His fingers didn't tremble. He laid it on the table, his eyes locked onto the judge's. And then he said something that made the entire courtroom go silent. Something that made even the judge sit up straight, his face turning pale. This wasn't a joke. This was real. And in that moment, everyone in the room realized, this boy wasn't just another kid. He was about to turn this case upside down. The judge stared at the folder on the table, his smirk replaced by a slight frown. The room was so quiet you could hear the distant hum of the courthouse air vents. "What exactly do you have in there, son?" the judge asked, his tone sharper now. The teen didn't hesitate. He slid the folder forward. "Evidence," he said. "Proof that this case isn't what it seems." The judge eyed the bailiff, who stepped forward, picked up the folder, and handed it over. As the judge flipped through the pages, his face shifted. First, skepticism. Then, confusion. Then, something closer to shock. He looked back up at the boy. "Where did you get these?" The teen didn't blink. "The law allows access to public records." "I found them." A murmur ran through the courtroom. People leaned forward, trying to get a glimpse. The prosecutor, a seasoned lawyer in his 50s, sat up straighter in his chair. His face had been one of amusement earlier. Now, it was one of concern. The judge closed the folder and exhaled. "Who are you, exactly?" The teen straightened his shoulders. "I'm the defendant's legal representative." The room erupted in gasps. The whispers turned into full conversations. "Wait, he's actually defending someone? This can't be legal." "Can it? What kind of judge allows this?" The judge banged his gavel. "Order." The courtroom quieted again, but now, all eyes were locked on the boy. The judge rubbed his temple. "Son, do you even have the qualifications to do this?" The teen gave a small smile. "According to the law, any individual can represent themselves in court. And as the defendant has designated me as his legal counsel, I have the right to speak on his behalf." The judge's eyes darkened. "That's a dangerous game you're playing." The teen tilted his head. "Only if I don't know the rules." "And I do." The judge was silent for a moment. Then, he turned his attention to the defendant, a middle-aged man in a faded button-up shirt, sitting quietly at the defense table. He looked nervous, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Is this true? The judge asked him. Did you agree to let this kid represent you? The man swallowed hard, then nodded. Yes, Your Honor. He's my lawyer. The judge leaned back, studying the boy with narrowed eyes. You do realize that if you mess this up, you could ruin this man's life? I understand, the teen said. His voice didn't waver. But I won't mess up. The prosecutor finally spoke. Your Honor, this is absurd. A minor cannot legally act as a lawyer in a court of law. The teen turned to him. Actually, he can. The prosecutor blinked. Excuse me? The teen picked up a piece of paper from his table and held it up. The law states that while one must be licensed to practice law formally, individuals can represent themselves or be represented by a non-attorney if permitted by the court. And unless Your Honor explicitly denies my request, I am fully within my rights to proceed. The judge looked at the paper, then at the prosecutor. He's not wrong. The prosecutor's face twitched. This is ridiculous. He's a child. The teen didn't respond to the insult. Instead, he calmly turned to the judge. Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to formally present my opening argument. The judge exhaled deeply, then glanced at the prosecutor. He's right. I haven't denied his request. You can't be serious, the prosecutor muttered. The judge hesitated for only a second longer. Then, he nodded. You may proceed. The courtroom held its breath. The teen turned, walked to the center of the room, and took a slow breath. His gaze swept over the crowd, some skeptical, some amused, some intrigued. And then he began to speak. What came out of his mouth next made everyone's jaws drop. The room was dead silent. All eyes were on the teenager standing in the center of the courtroom, his expression calm, his stance steady. He wasn't intimidated by the judge's scowl, the prosecutor's disbelief, or the murmurs of the audience. He took a deep breath. Then, in a clear, steady voice, he began. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. This case is not what it seems. And by the time I'm done, you'll see the truth. The prosecutor scoffed. This is a joke. The teen turned to him, unshaken. If it's a joke, then you shouldn't have any trouble proving me wrong. But you won't. Because I have facts. And facts don't care about age. The prosecutor clenched his jaw. The judge raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. The teen continued, pacing slightly as he spoke. The prosecution is presenting this case as open and shut. A crime was committed, and they believe they have their suspect. But what if I told you that their entire argument is built on an assumption rather than evidence? The courtroom rustled with whispers. The judge frowned. Get to the point, kid. The teen stopped pacing and turned to the jury. The prosecution will tell you that my client was at the scene of the crime. They'll tell you that he had a motive. But what they won't tell you, what they haven't told you, is that the key witness they're relying on has given 3 different statements to 3 different officers. And not a single one of those statements matches the evidence. The prosecutor's head snapped up. What? The teen walked over to the table, picked up the folder he had placed there earlier, and flipped it open. Right here. These are the official witness statements. I took the liberty of cross-referencing them against the forensic report. He held up a page. And what I found was interesting. The judge motioned for the bailiff to retrieve the documents. As he read through them, his expression darkened. The prosecutor, looking flustered, leaned over the desk, whispering to his assistant. The teen smiled slightly. I see you weren't aware of this discrepancy. That's unfortunate. Because it means your entire case just fell apart. The courtroom gasped. The judge's fingers drummed against the bench. You're telling me, he said slowly, that the prosecution's key witness provided conflicting statements? The teen nodded. Yes, Your Honor. And I'm not done. The judge stared at him. Go on. The teen walked back to the table and pulled out another document. According to the forensic report, the crime scene showed no fingerprints from my client. No DNA. Nothing that would suggest he was there. The only reason he was arrested was because of that faulty witness testimony. He held up a different report. But the police ignored another key suspect. Someone with an actual motive. Someone who does have fingerprints on the scene. And someone the prosecution conveniently left out of their argument. The prosecutor stood up. Objection. Your Honor, this is. The judge held up his hand, silencing him. Then he turned to the teen. Who are you talking about? The teen took a deep breath. Then, with steady hands, he turned the page and revealed a name. The judge's eyes widened. The prosecutor went pale. The entire courtroom held its breath. Because the name on that paper was someone nobody expected. Someone who was never even considered a suspect. And in that moment, the entire case flipped upside down. The prosecutor's face drained of color. He grabbed the document from the bailiff, scanning the name. His lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers gripping the edge of the paper so tightly it crinkled. The judge, too, seemed taken aback. He adjusted his glasses and stared at the page. You're telling me, he said, his voice dangerously calm, that this person, this individual, was never investigated? The teen nodded. That's correct, Your Honor. The prosecutor quickly regained his composure. He stood up, straightening his suit. This is absurd, he said, forcing a chuckle. This boy is grasping at straws. Your Honor, the prosecution has already presented sufficient evidence to prove the defendant's guilt. The teen raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Because if the prosecution was so confident, I doubt they'd be sweating right now. A few quiet chuckles echoed in the courtroom. The prosecutor shot the teen a glare before turning to the judge. Your Honor, we request that this line of questioning be dismissed. This so-called evidence is irrelevant. The teen took a step forward. Objection, Your Honor. It is highly relevant. It proves that the police conducted a rushed and biased investigation. They ignored key evidence, failed to follow up on leads, and arrested the wrong man simply because it was convenient. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. The court will take a 10-minute recess. Prosecutor, I suggest you take this time to explain to me why this suspect was never investigated. The tension in the room was suffocating. The prosecutor swallowed, nodding stiffly, before storming out of the courtroom with his team. The judge turned to the teen. You've certainly made things interesting. The teen nodded. That's my job. The judge leaned back. I have to admit, I didn't expect this. A kid walking into my courtroom, picking apart an experienced prosecutor's case piece by piece? I thought you were just some overconfident kid trying to make a point. The teen met his gaze, his expression unreadable. I wasn't trying to make a point, Your Honor. I was trying to stop a man from being wrongfully convicted. The judge studied him for a long moment before exhaling. Recess is in 10 minutes. Be ready. The teen nodded and sat down. As soon as the judge left the bench, the whispers in the room exploded. Did you see the prosecutor's face? Who is this kid? How does he know so much? Is he even allowed to do this? The defendant, the man he was representing, leaned in. His voice was barely above a whisper. Are you sure about this? The teen looked at him. Yes. They were never expecting someone to challenge them. But now, they have no choice but to listen. The man sighed, rubbing his face. Kid, I don't know how you learned all this, but, thank you. The teen didn't answer immediately. He simply sat there, gripping the edge of the table, deep in thought. Because there was something nobody in the courtroom knew yet. Something he hadn't told anyone. Something that made this case personal. And by the time the trial resumed, that secret would change everything. The courtroom doors swung open as the prosecutor strode back inside, his face tight with frustration. His team followed, whispering among themselves. They had used the short recess to regroup, but it was clear, this was no longer the easy case they had expected. The teen sat motionless at the defense table, hands folded, eyes locked forward. He wasn't rattled. If anything, he looked even more focused. The judge re-entered and took his seat. Court is back in session. He turned to the prosecutor. Do you have an explanation for why this suspect was never investigated? The prosecutor cleared his throat. Your Honor, the suspect in question was ruled out early due to a lack of evidence. The teen leaned forward. That's not true. The prosecutor shot him a sharp look. Excuse me? The teen stood, walking to the center of the room. Let's look at the facts. This suspect, he gestured to the paper, had direct ties to the crime scene. His fingerprints were found on multiple surfaces. My client's? Nowhere. Yet, somehow, the police ignored him and focused on an innocent man. The judge exhaled sharply. Prosecutor, is this true? The man hesitated. Your Honor, this is an unnecessary distraction. Answer the question. The prosecutor clenched his jaw. There were procedural errors in the early investigation. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The teen took a slow breath. Procedural errors? He shook his head. No. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. The prosecutor scoffed. Are you accusing the police of intentionally ignoring evidence? The teen didn't hesitate. Yes. The room fell into a stunned silence. Even the judge looked taken aback. The prosecutor let out a humorless laugh. That's ridiculous. Is it? The teen turned, walking toward the jury. Let's consider the timeline. The police arrested my client within hours of the crime. They barely conducted any interviews. They ignored forensic inconsistencies. And most importantly, he turned, staring directly at the prosecutor, they ignored the fact that the real suspect had motive. The prosecutor's confidence wavered. And what motive would that be? The teen took a deep breath. His hands clenched slightly at his sides. And then he said something that made the entire courtroom gasp. Because that suspect was responsible for my mother's death. Silence. A pin could have dropped, and it would have echoed. The judge's brows furrowed. Explain. The teen swallowed hard, but his voice remained steady. Years ago, my mother was the victim of a crime. A crime that was never solved. I was just a kid when it happened, but I remember everything. I remember the police brushing it off, the case growing cold, and the man who walked away without consequences. The same man who should have been a suspect in this case. The prosecutor's face paled. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. You're telling me this isn't just a legal case for you? The teen nodded. That's exactly what I'm saying. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge tapped his gavel. Quiet. He turned back to the teen. And you believe the prosecution deliberately ignored this suspect to protect him? The teen exhaled slowly. I don't just believe it, Your Honor. I can prove it. Another wave of murmurs rippled through the room. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. This is absurd. You're letting a child throw around baseless accusations. The judge ignored him. He turned to the teen. If what you're saying is true, then you have just changed the entire course of this trial. The teen nodded. That was the plan. The judge glanced between the teen and the prosecutor before sitting back in his chair. Proceed. And just like that, the courtroom's power shifted. The teen was no longer just defending his client. He was exposing the truth. And nothing would ever be the same. The air in the courtroom felt heavy, like the walls themselves were closing in. The teen stood firm in the center of the room, his hands steady, his heart pounding. The judge eyed him with a new level of scrutiny. You claim you can prove this suspect was involved in your mother's case and this one? The teen nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The prosecutor's voice cut through the tense silence. Your Honor, we cannot allow this circus to continue. This boy is using the courtroom to air personal grievances. There is no proof connecting these cases. The teen turned to him unfazed. You're afraid, aren't you? The prosecutor scoffed. Afraid of what? A kid with a conspiracy theory? No, the teen said calmly. Afraid that I'm right. The courtroom held its breath. The judge motioned for him to continue. The teen walked over to the table, picking up another document. Your Honor, I obtained this report from a private investigator. Someone who actually cared about the evidence the police ignored. He handed the paper to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. The prosecutor crossed his arms. And what exactly does this report prove? The judge's eyes moved rapidly over the paper. His jaw tightened. Then, he slowly lifted his gaze. Prosecutor, the judge said carefully, would you like to explain why the suspect in question, who was supposedly ruled out, was seen making large cash deposits shortly after both crimes took place? The prosecutor flinched. The teen stepped forward. This man was paid off to make evidence disappear. And you know it. The prosecutor's face turned red. That's an outrageous accusation. The teen held up another document. Bank statements. I cross-referenced them with police records. The officer who arrested my client? He's connected to those same deposits. The courtroom erupted. The judge slammed his gavel. Order. The prosecutor's voice rose. Your Honor, this is pure speculation. The judge's voice was stone cold. No, this is evidence. He turned to the teen. And it changes everything. The teen nodded. That was my goal. The prosecutor gritted his teeth. Even if that's true, it doesn't prove that your client is innocent. The teen's gaze sharpened. That's where you're wrong. He turned to the bailiff. Could you please play the security footage I submitted earlier? The prosecutor stiffened. The judge nodded. Proceed. A screen lit up. Grainy footage from a security camera played. It showed the crime scene, the exact moment the incident took place. And then, there it was. A figure stepping into view. A man, not the defendant, doing something the police claimed never happened. Planting evidence. Tampering with the crime scene. Clearing someone else's tracks. The jury gasped. The judge turned to the prosecutor. What do you have to say about this? The prosecutor swallowed hard, his forehead damp with sweat. The teen's voice cut in. I'll tell you what's happening, Your Honor. The police, the prosecution, they built this case on convenience, not facts. And now the truth is out. The prosecutor had no words. He looked completely cornered. The judge turned back to the jury, his expression dark. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've seen enough. The courtroom buzzed with energy. The teen turned to his client. The man looked at him, eyes wide with disbelief. Did you just win? He whispered. The teen exhaled. Not yet. Because there was still one more thing left to do. And it would change everything. The courtroom was buzzing. The energy had shifted, completely. The judge leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him. His expression was unreadable, but his silence was louder than any gavel strike. The prosecutor looked completely defeated. His confidence had shattered the moment the security footage played. His eyes darted toward the exit, as if contemplating an escape, but there was nowhere to run. The teen took a slow breath, steadying himself. Your Honor, he said, turning back to the judge, at this point, I believe it is clear. My client is innocent. The real suspect was ignored. The police failed to do their job. And the prosecution built their case on false evidence. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. I must admit, this is the most unorthodox trial I have ever witnessed. He glanced at the prosecutor. And I must also admit that the defense has presented compelling evidence that raises serious doubts about the integrity of this case. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had no counterargument left. The judge turned to the jury. Given the circumstances, I see no reason to delay this decision further. Does the prosecution have anything to add before I make my ruling? The prosecutor opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it. He shook his head, his face burning with humiliation. Very well, the judge said. He turned to the jury. Have you reached a verdict? The foreman, an older man with deep wrinkles and wise eyes, stood. He held a small slip of paper, his hands steady. We have, Your Honor. The tension in the room spiked. The judge nodded. Please read the verdict. The foreman cleared his throat. On the charge of, he paused, looking at the defendant, we find the defendant, not guilty. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A second later, the room erupted into cheers. The defendant slumped forward, his hands gripping the table as relief washed over him. He turned to the teen, his eyes filled with gratitude. You saved my life, kid. The teen smiled, but there was no arrogance in it, just quiet satisfaction. I told you we'd prove the truth. The judge tapped his gavel again, bringing the room back to order. The defendant is free to go. Court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room. It was over. The prosecutor slumped back in his chair, defeated. The teen turned, gathering his papers, his hands finally trembling now that the battle was over. He had done it. He had taken on the system, faced the odds, and won. But as he turned to leave, the judge called out. Wait. The teen paused, looking up. The judge studied him for a long moment before speaking. You were underestimated when you walked into this courtroom. I know I was one of the people who doubted you. But today, you showed something rare, courage, intelligence, and an unwavering sense of justice. The room fell silent again. You remind me of someone I used to know, the judge said. Someone who fought for the truth, even when no one believed them. The teen swallowed. And what happened to them? The judge gave a small smile. They became one of the best lawyers I've ever seen. A long pause. Then, the judge straightened. If you ever decide to make this your career, you have a future in this courtroom. The teen blinked. For the first time, he was speechless. The judge gave him a small nod. You did well today. Now go. The teen nodded back and turned, walking out of the courtroom. The second he stepped outside, the cool air hit his face. It was over. He had proved the truth. And more importantly, he had proved himself. As he walked down the steps of the courthouse, he smiled to himself. This was only the beginning. Final life lesson. Never judge someone by their age, their background, or their circumstances. The most unexpected people can rise to the greatest challenges. Justice isn't about power, it's about truth. And sometimes, the ones we least expect are the ones who change everything.